All right, all right. I'm not too sure why the screen is so big, but welcome to Uncle Bobbie's virtual author event. I'm Shawnee from Uncle Bobbie's in Philly, and today we have the pleasure of hosting a great event. We have Brandy Colbert, and she'll be discussing her new book, Blackbirds in the Sky. If the title itself didn't hook you, wait until this conversation gets going because I was just in the green room with those two women and listen. But she'll be joined in conversation by the equally talented Kekla Magoon, and I'm super excited to have them here with us tonight. Of course, following the conversation, there will be a live Q&A. So make sure that you submit those questions in the Ask a Question module that should be located at the bottom of the screen. And if you are in the Philly or Germantown area, stop by Uncle Bobbie's and pick up your copy. But if you aren't, no worries. We do have a bookshop website that you can order the book from and have it sent straight to you. Just use the link that should be at the bottom. It says Buy Blackbirds in the Sky. Brandy Colbert is the critically acclaimed author of the novels Point, The Voting Booth, Finding Yvonne, The Revolution of Birdie Randolph, The Only Black Girls in Town, and the Stonewall Award winner, Little and Lion. A trained journalist, she's also worked with the boundary breaking ballet dancer Misty Copeland to adapt her memoir into the best-selling book, Life in Motion, the Young Readers Edition. She is on the faculty at Hamline University's MFA degree program for writing for children and young adults. You can find her online at www.brandycolbert.com. Kekla Magoon grew up in Indiana, but she wanted to see the rest of the world. Now, she travels all over the country, meeting young readers and sharing her books, which include The Rock and the River, Camel Girl, and Shadows of Sherwood, the Robin Hoodlum Adventure series. She has won numerous awards for her work, including 3 Coretta Scott King honors, an NAACP Image Award, the Walter Award honor, and inclusion on the National Book Award long list. You can visit her online at keklamagoon.com and you'll see that she is anything but ordinary. And with that, I'd like to introduce these 2 wonderful women to the screen. And let's get this conversation going. So I'm going to bring them back in and we should be ready to go. Hi.
Hi.
And Brandy.
Hi. Thank you, Shawnee.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'll be here if y'all need me.
All right. Sounds good. Hi, Brandy.
Hi, Kekla. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you too. We were just in the green room getting all set up and started chatting, and I thought, oh my goodness, we better start rolling the camera because we're already on a roll talking about our work and the things that we have in common and the challenges that we face in the work that we do. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk with you. It's really fun for me to have some colleagues who are doing the same thing essentially that I'm doing in terms of being novelists for most of our work, but also doing some nonfiction and having these really exciting and compelling, in my view, nonfiction books that are out right now. My new book is called Revolution in Our Time, the Black Panther Party's Promise to the People, and it's not out yet, but it's about to come out.
And it's a National Book Award finalist. I feel like you're not going to say that, so I'm just going to tell everybody.
Thank you. You're very kind. Yes, we turned in our bios before Tuesday when that happened. But tonight we are here to celebrate Blackbirds in the Sky, which is phenomenal and sucked me right in. And it was particularly, yes, beautiful. Yay. Hold it up again because everybody can see the cover. It's a really striking cover. And yeah, like Ashani said, if you haven't been sucked in just by the title, you will be sucked in by the cover and then by the opening, just hearing Brandy draw you into the story and talking about, her own experience coming to study this history. So just to start us off, can you give us a little introduction to the book? Tell us a little bit about what drew you to this subject matter and, what we'll get.
Yeah, so I'll just start out with a brief description of the Tulsa Race Massacre for anyone who does not know what happened. It was 100 years ago. We commemorated the 100th anniversary over Memorial Day this year. So in 1921, a young Black man named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a young white woman named Sarah Page. He was quickly arrested, the next day for this and taken to a jail cell at the top of the Tulsa County Courthouse, which is notable because at the time in the 1800s, early 1900s, they were building these special jail cells on the tops of courthouses to specifically keep white mobs from going there to take Black prisoners down and lynch them. I'm not always Black, most often Black, but sometimes white as well. But there was a lynching problem. So they had these special cells built to try to deter that from happening. He was placed in one of those special cells, but the white mob still gathered outside and began threatening to lynch him. Black men from the Greenwood district, otherwise known as Black Wall Street, marched across the train tracks to try to stop it, to try to protect him. They were armed to show that they, meant business about protecting him. And then some of the white mob were threatened by the fact that they had guns, and a scuffle ensued. Then the white mob essentially went back on the other side of the train tracks and, began killing, looting, and destroying homes and businesses. So, I was drawn to this. I don't remember when I first learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was like somewhere in the last 5 to 10 years. But I was reminded of it certainly when I watched the show Watchmen on HBO a couple of years ago, which is when I think probably the majority of Americans actually learned about it, sadly. And I just thought this is really interesting, and they just portrayed it so well in the show. And I thought, all of that, once I started actually digging into the research, I learned, all of that was true, what was happening. And I just decided that I would love to, I knew that it was true what had happened, but just the way that they depicted it in the show was so cinematic. You kind of thought it couldn't actually be true, but all of it was. And so I decided it would be really interesting and perhaps useful to write a book for teens about this, because I didn't see anything out there at the time that actually dove into this. So that's kind of the genesis of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I don't actually remember learning about the Tulsa Race Massacre at all as a young person. I don't remember learning about it even in college. I mean, I feel like I learned about it just a few years ago, largely in the course of researching my own book and looking at just Black history, Black American history in, really granular detail to try to, look at all the different moments that we've experienced. And this was a really powerful one. And, I'm continually sort of shocked and angry, frankly, that I don't know a lot of these stories and haven't heard these stories and that they're not taught, and so it really is powerful to see the narrative in full, the way that you've portrayed it. And so one of the things that particularly strikes me about just the narrative in general is the Greenwood district and how sort of thriving and amazing it was in its day. And, I think that the narrative of Blackness often implies or is sort of loaded with a sense of poverty and struggle. And that's so ingrained in our cultural storytelling that few people even realize that there were these prosperous and thriving Black communities that developed in the course of Reconstruction and around the turn of the 20th century. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the Greenwood district and sort of what it was like before it was destroyed.
Yeah, and I like that you brought that up, because I feel like even for those of us who maybe didn't grow up in poverty or, poor, lower income households, still had this sort of narrative about well, all Black people, are this, or all Black people are that. And so it felt like, people were looking at you like, oh, but you're not like these other Black people, was sort of like the experience I had growing up in a very white town, which, I didn't like, because I knew that I was like other Black people. I just happened to have different circumstances than were being kind of taught widespread, sort of. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, so the Greenwood district was, it was unique and it wasn't. There were a lot of kind of thriving neighborhoods like this. And Oklahoma itself, I was really surprised to learn that there is this whole history of all Black towns. And I just found that so fascinating. And there's still 13 of them that exist today. But there were, quite a few, I think several dozen at one time. And so the Greenwood district, some people who came from those all black towns in Oklahoma came to Tulsa to help found the Greenwood District. But, it was founded by these two men, O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford, who were both sons of formerly enslaved people. And so a lot of the people that came to Tulsa were also formerly enslaved from the South, or descendants of, formerly enslaved people. And they came there because, Tulsa seemed like a place of promise at the time. It was a booming oil town. Oklahoma was a pretty new state at the time. And so people really wanted to come there for the opportunities. And yeah, it was like everything you could find, everything you wanted to find, you could find there. So, there were clothing shops, tailoring shops, confectionaries, movie theaters, churches, schools. Like it was just, doctor's offices, everything that you could need was there. And one thing I find, really interesting about it that I read was that, a dollar would circulate throughout the Greenwood District about 30 times before it would leave, that community and move on. And I just found that so fascinating and so wonderful to think of this, Black community that built itself up from nothing, primarily because they were shut out of the white community, and then built this really amazing, neighborhood and district where they could just thrive and be themselves and not have to worry about anyone else for their own livelihood.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's such a powerful image, like the idea that of that kind of, I guess we would say self-sufficiency, right? Or self-determination, right? The sense that, okay, like, sure, we're not allowed in that part of town. Okay, we're going to make this part of town really spectacular. And there's a really powerful sort of message and image in that I think has really been deliberately stripped away from the way that we talk about history. It's been troubling to me to think about how we reinforce narratives of struggle and narratives of being less than. Frankly, like we find subtle ways to suggest that we continue to be less than, as if we ever were less than, right? I mean, it's just this perpetual thing. And I particularly, there are so many things that resonated with me in the narrative, but hearing you talking in the foreword about your own experience sort of coming to Black history, and you talked about kind of a process of overcoming your own hesitation to study Black history, and that you almost had kind of an aversion to it, or dreaded history class, right, when you were a kid, because of the way that it was taught, and because of the way that you feel sitting in class when it's like, oh, slavery unit is coming on, and you just know that it's a thing that's put upon us, I think, as young Black students. And I felt that same way. And I also grew up in a predominantly white community, and so it definitely, Black History Month, like all of that was sort of a time of othering, a time when I felt both proud and excited about the history, somewhat proud and excited about the history, but also a little called out and a little bit sort of worried and nervous. So I definitely resonated with that feeling that you described. I would have said I hated history class because it seemed like a lot of dates and names, but at the same time, I loved reading historical fiction. Like I would go home and read, devour all these historical narratives, because the idea that history is story I didn't connect with that idea until much, much later. And so, for me, injecting that sense of narrative was really transformative. And so I'm interested in, and I guess in your thoughts about that now, in terms of, sort of how you've sort of grown into this study, pursuing the study of your own accord, right? You're not in history class anymore where somebody's telling you must learn about this. You're saying, oh, I want to dive in and investigate this. And, I think one of the things we have in common in our writing is trying to illuminate lesser told aspects of Black history. And so I'm just interested in hearing you talk about your relationship to that material now, and how it's evolving for you.
Yeah. And honestly, like, I'm so glad to hear you say that. Not that you had to grow up feeling that way also, but, I feel like we had kind of this feeling like we have to be stuck to the person we were. Like, if you didn't like history, then you're still going to hate history. And it's like, no, I just didn't realize at the time that I could grow to love this thing that I do now. But yeah, it just always felt like there was no place for us really, or that, all of the history again was just all the negative stuff about being a Black American, not all of the positives, of which there are, quite, lots and lots. So yeah, I really did not like it in school. It just never felt like it was catered to me in any way. And even when we did study those subjects, it was like, yeah, embarrassing and just not a thoughtful lesson, and not a detailed lesson at all. So I was in my 20s before I really started to appreciate history. One thing I remember is when I was about 27, I had already moved to LA where I live now, but I read a newspaper article in 2006 that was commemorating the 100th anniversary of a triple lynching in my hometown, which I talk about in the forward. And, I was shocked. I had been born and raised there. I lived in that town in Springfield, Missouri for 22 years, and I never knew about this lynching. And so I'm reading these newspaper articles and just like crying, just trying to figure out like, wow, this makes so much sense now. It gave context to the reason why I grew up in a predominantly white town, because all of the Black people were essentially chased out or ran away after a triple lynching in 1906 because they didn't feel safe. And so that really made me start thinking and start looking up, just looking up other things. I'd maybe catch a name that I didn't know, like Fannie Lou Hamer at the time. And be like, wait, she was the woman who said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Like, what else did she do? And then finding out she was this amazing voting rights activist woman, an advocate for poor communities. Like, so I think just, it's kind of like a snowball effect, right? Like, I'm sure you got this, you were researching your Black Panther book. It's like, you just go down these rabbit holes and you start understanding just how much you weren't taught and just how much interesting like information there is out there. And it's not that this information isn't available, it's there. There are books about these people, like there have been since we were kids, but we were just never exposed to it. And so, for me, I'm like, feel like I'm on this like crusade now to get other people interested in history. I also had this coworker who I named in the acknowledgments. My old coworker Harry Gamble. He was like a 30-year newspaper veteran, but we ended up working together at this job in Chicago where we were writing. And we sat in the same office, and so he would just like tell me these like random stories from history, and I would be like, what are you talking about? But like I would be like wrapped, because he was just like, the way he told it was so fascinating. And that's when I really learned like, oh, like you said, it's a story, like this is interesting, and like all of this stuff has context behind it. And so that's what made it really fascinating to me. And I just sort of never turned back. I started incorporating historical stuff into my fiction, and then adapting books about history, and then was just like, okay, I've got to try to write my own. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's always a process, right? I mean, we're always, I think, growing into the stories that we want to tell and figuring out, what am I ready to write? What am I ready to talk about? How do I enter sort of this creative space with all of these questions and all of these, sort of all these tiers, right? Everything that you've discovered, all these facts and tidbits and little pieces that I want to put into something, right? It's this whole process of putting everything together. And I'm sure that everybody listening would love to hear you talk a little bit about your process of putting this book together. I'm curious about a number of factors of the writing process, but I guess we should start with research. So it sounds like you definitely sort of had some sparks, right? Discovering articles and sort of stumbling into information that made you curious and want to dig, which is fabulous. I mean, I think that's the way we all start, and a great way to start, right? In igniting passion in that way. But then it becomes a thing you do, right? A thing you pursue and a thing you do deliberately. And so I'm curious about what that process looked like for you, the research process, and what you did once you had the spark and decided you were going to be brave and go for it.
Yeah. It is an undertaking. It does feel very brave to like be like, I know you know this, to be like, I'm going to try to write a nonfiction book now. But yeah, when I was reading about just sort of the basic story of it, I tried to like pull out these sections that were interesting to me. So like, learning about the Tulsa Tribune and like how the media contributed to a lot of this. I was like, wow, that's interesting. So I definitely want to write a chapter on that. And then, definitely thinking about like the genesis of Black Wall Street itself. I wanted to write a chapter about that. And then, I'm thinking, okay, well, I can't tell this story without talking about, Black Americans and sort of Reconstruction, what happened after enslaved people were freed. So kind of drawing on all of those things, I wrote pretty much my first outline for a book ever and decided to go from there. And yeah, my research, looking back, I'm sure I'll probably be reaching out to you when I work on my next nonfiction book to be like, how do I actually organize this stuff? Because, I'm not like Okay, so maybe this is just like the process. Yeah. So I was just like, how does this work? I didn't have a good process for it, but I have a journalism degree, so I did know the proper way to research, and the way to source, reputable quotes and information. So that was really helpful to just have that background in me. And I also have fact checked a lot of nonfiction books for younger readers. So I think that actually, I haven't actually talked about that yet this week, but I think that was one of the biggest helps for me because, again, like I already knew how to find information right away to know, is this like a legitimate source? And I'm not just talking about like Wikipedia, like there's some things out there where you're just like, this is like not quite correct, or this is not a quite reputable source. So that really helped to be able to like have that discernment there. But yeah, I found, the Oklahoma State Legislature had a really helpful commission report they put out in 2001 for the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that just was immensely helpful. It had, like minute by minute details about what happened over those days. And so that was really helpful to actually craft those chapters that detailed the massacre. Books by some scholars and academics who have been, studying this and researching it for years, like Scott Ellsworth, Eddie Faye Gates, and Hannibal B. Johnson. All of their work was extremely helpful. And then, besides that, just other books. Just kind of random books, articles, old newspaper articles, new ones, magazine articles, historical websites, just so much. You kind of hear people talk about research and just hear about all these different places they pull from. But I don't know if we ever expect, like, I don't know if you were surprised during your research, like, I can't think of any place that I was actually surprised that I pulled from, but just more like the aggregate of all of it. Like when I got done with it, I was like, wow, like, this just came from so many different places. Like there's just so much, we live in this age where, we wouldn't have been able to do it this way, like 20 years ago, or maybe 25, 30 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to pull information this way. We would have been living in libraries the whole time. And so it was nice to be able to go online for some of this as well. And just, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like I need to be reaching out to you to find out about checking procedures because I did it, for the book and I found that I ended up having to kind of retrace a lot of steps because I would think, okay, I think I understand how this looks. And then like some new fact would come in and I'd be like, wait, what? That kind of reshapes this. Not that the facts I had before were wrong, but it's like new information kind of sheds new light and it becomes this whole sort of really dynamic puzzle. And, definitely to your point about, what we couldn't have done, 20 years ago, this whole process would have been so different 20 years ago for both for better and worse, I think, in terms of, that question of facts, right? You can go online, Google anything and stuff will come up.
Mm-hmm.
But the process of figuring out, is this a reputable website? Can I trust this information? Where does it come from? That whole discernment process. You could teach a course just on that, right? Of like, how do you figure out if the source is reputable and whatnot? And, I found that a particularly challenging process. And in the, I worked on mine for 10 years because that's when my novel, The Rock and the River, which is about the Black Panthers, came out. And then I decided I need to do a nonfiction book companion. And while I didn't work on it continuously for 10 years, I was in touch with the material for all of that time. And it radically changed just how much information was available online versus how much you had to physically go places to look for it. Right. Even within that decade, it was really transformative. 10 years ago, I was sitting in Oakland with little white gloves, going through boxes of ephemera, and looking at the newspapers all crinkly and old. And now it's like, a year ago, when I'm almost done with the book, I find, someone has digitized the entire Black Panther
right
newspaper. That would have been useful, but it's new and things are transforming. And so it's pretty exciting and dynamic, I think, to be writing in the field of, American history, specifically as told through the lens of Blackness. But it is also, I think, with new information and new access comes sort of all these new challenges and pitfalls like you're talking about. So that sounds amazing. It really sounds like you dove deep into every facet, and definitely it comes across in the book. With, all the different focuses and just foci, I guess, all the different, sort of like, let's look at this aspect of things, let's look at this aspect of things, let me tell you about how we got here, right? And I love that kind of context. For me, that's really enriching, and it gives a really full and well-rounded picture. what was happening in this place that's so far away from, you know, my own moment and my own experience, but I'm sitting on my couch going, oh, like I can picture what it would be like to be in that place in that time. And I love that. And so, you know, in terms of, I mean, I think, I mentioned earlier, we both also write fiction, and that was how I was first introduced to your work, was through your fiction. And, you know, we talked about the sense of narrative, right? Like wanting to bring history to life through stories and through characters and through this kind of context. And so I'm curious about how you find that transition. I mean, earlier you kind of said it was a bit of an evolution, right? Like maybe a little historical fiction, maybe some adaptations, right? Like sort of inching your way toward this really exciting opportunity to say, I'm going to tell this story the way I want to tell it in my own voice, right? Like that's a really powerful place to be, you know, where you've arrived. And so I'm curious about how you feel about the sort of process of going from fiction to nonfiction, and if you what that transition is like for you or has been like for you, and if you feel like you use similar skills when you're doing both, or if it's just a really different experience overall.
Yeah, you know, I mean, after I got done with the research, which it wasn't like I just did a bunch of research and then sat down and wrote the book, you know, it's like lots of like, oh, wait, you know, finding new information, like adding it in. Yeah, it was not exactly that much of a streamlined process for me. But yeah, I just was kind of surprised though, once I did start writing, that it still felt so similar to writing fiction in a way. I mean, you know, it's very much not, but the fact that, you know, I wanted it to be narrative nonfiction as much as I could make it that way. Because for me, you know, what really resonated in the past was people speaking to me like in that sort of like, you know, I'm telling you a story way. But yeah, I was kind of surprised that it wasn't so different, and that I was able to sort of get my voice in there, you know, like it's still facts and it's all the truth, and you know, none of this is made up, but like I'm still in a way, you know, telling the story that the way that I would just do so if I were talking to you in person. So that was really kind of interesting to me, and that I could just bring my voice, and that it didn't have to be this like dry textbook, you know, story of the Tulsa Race Massacre. So that was really kind of refreshing. But yeah, I mean, it is totally different from writing fiction, because in a way it feels easier at sometimes because you only have so much information to work with, especially if you're writing about, you know, like I don't know about the black, I know you went like really far back too, so you probably had, you know, some sections that was, it's a little bit harder to find information. There's not always that much, you know, especially with the Tulsa Race Massacre, like, you know, part of the whole thing is there was a concerted effort to hide it. So there's really not as much information out there as there probably should be. But then, you know, sometimes I did sort of yearn for that feeling of writing fiction where I'm like, I can just write whatever I want today. Like it's all up to me. It's my choice. These characters do what I tell them to do. And so,
Yes.
you know, it's kind of that, like, you know, it's like kind of like when you're drafting, you wish you were revising. And when you're revising, you wish you were drafting. It's kind of that thing where I'm like, I love the process of nonfiction, but I was just sort of like, oh, I just want to do what I want. And then like, you know, immediately after I wrote this book, I like drafted a novel, and I was just like, oh, like I wish I just had, you know, all of these like facts and documents and things to work with. So I really think there's advantages to both. Like I certainly hope to be doing both, just dipping in and out of fiction and nonfiction, you know, forever, hopefully. I'm curious what that process was like for you. Was it a lot different for you than writing fiction, or how did that work?
It definitely feels a lot different to me than writing fiction. I mean, and I think it's partly because I worked on the book for such a long time, this nonfiction. And so it was like, I was always kind of doing it kind of in between other novels. And so it felt kind of like a breath of fresh air in certain ways, and you know, like, here I go again in certain ways, to dive back into it. But when it comes to, you know, sort of really sitting down and trying to tell the story, I one of the things I sort of worried about and struggled with was, you know, how much am I presenting narrative, right? Interesting stories about people, and how much am I doing this kind of thing I do in my head of analyzing, right? I am a very analytical type of writer, and I want to say, okay, like I want to explain to you the context of this moment, and I want you to understand politically and socially and culturally like what is going on. But you know, is that less interesting than if I just say, hey, so there were these guys and they went out one night and here's what happened, right? And so like for me, trying to balance that, like my desire to be super analytical and my desire to be super narrative, like I feel like I fall more on the analytical end of the spectrum when it comes to nonfiction writing. And so it was a challenge for me, and something I worked on to try to have the book feel also narrative, and have it feel like there were lots of characters in play, because really the main character of the book is the Panther Party. So not any individuals, but this whole group. And so trying to humanize their narrative, because their narrative has been so reduced to this particular snapshot, and almost like it's reduced past humans to like a picture of a gun or something, right? And so it's trying to bring back all of the people, all of the smiles, all of the breakfast programs and everything that they did that was incredibly dynamic, while also saying, well, but here's what was going on behind it, and here's what was going on around it. And so I feel like that was a big challenge for me. And I mean, honestly, it was like very refreshing to read your book and see you doing some of the same things, because I was like, okay, because I'm very close to my own work, that to the point where I sometimes can't tell, like, I'm like, is this working? And I can read yours and be like, oh, okay, no, I see how, like, I'm really engaged by this, so maybe that means people will be engaged by what I did. Like, it was very exciting.
Yeah, I felt the same way. Like when I read some passages of your book, I was like, oh, okay, it made me feel like confident, like, okay, I think I did this right, maybe.
Like I was like, oh no, this can work, I'm excited. So I like the sort of the way the books can be in conversation with each other.
Absolutely.
And it's exciting to to have like, I studied the Massacre briefly, because it's like a page in my book, and then to see it sort of like opened up. Like I love the idea of all of these books popping up from us and from other writers that are gonna really just populate our history, and the way that we understand American history is just going to transform everything. And I'm really excited about it, and I love seeing it happen. So I'm really pleased to be here with you, both physically right now, but also in that bigger kind of goal, that vision for what we want for young readers and what we want for the world. I mean, I'm excited to feel like I have people that I'm walking with in that journey.
Yes. No, I absolutely feel the same way too. Yeah.
Yay. I'm curious, because we're talking about sort of narrative and things. If you have any favorite anecdotes that you uncovered in the course of writing this history that didn't end up making it into the book, or made it differently into the book than you might have initially thought.
Yeah, there was one so the Oklahoma chapter, that's what starts off the book after the foreword, and it was just so, I don't know, it felt kind of unwieldy at times, because I mean, you're trying to write about the history of this whole state, which is so funny. I never would have imagined that, because I grew up 3 hours, probably 2 hours from the actual Oklahoma state line, and have driven through it several times, been to Tulsa several times, and just no offense to any Oklahomans who may be watching, but I just always, because I'm a Missourian, and listen, I get it, like I know how people think of Missouri, but I just kind of thought like Oklahoma was just kind of boring. Like it just felt like a flat state, and I just like didn't really understand. I didn't even understand, about like the Trail of Tears, and even though it ran right through my hometown, it was just like, I don't know. So I didn't have really any understanding of it, and so researching it, I was like, oh my God, like Oklahoma is wild. Like it just, there were so many interesting things and so many horrible things in its past, obviously, starting with the forced relocation of Native tribes. But like, I was just shocked by all of the information I found out. I didn't know about the land runs and all of that stuff. But one thing I wanted to make it in, but it was just, I found it too late, and the chapter was already a lot and just didn't have space for it. There was a young girl named Sarah Rector, and she was like the world's youngest and probably like first Black millionaire, like Black girl millionaire. I'm probably getting those designations wrong, but she was like a young girl who was like a Black millionaire from like an oil well that she technically owned. But then there were all these like, racist guardianship laws at the time. So anytime like a Black person would actually, gain wealth at the time, a white person would sweep in and need to suddenly be their guardian. And then, where does the wealth go? So, I really wanted to write about that, but I wasn't able to fit it in. And then I saw that Tanya Bolden had a book about Sarah Rector that she published a few years ago, maybe like 2017, maybe, or something like that. So that is out there for anyone who's intrigued by Sarah Rector's story. I certainly want to read more about her. But yeah, it was really like the Oklahoma chapter probably could be an entire book just from everything that happened there. So that was really hard to sort of cull down. At one point, I remember just sort of, I'm sure you had this problem where you're just like, what all do I include? Like you're going through so many years, so many decades and centuries even often. And so I remember emailing my editor and just being like, what do I do? Like, I don't know how to, like, how much information to include. There's so much stuff. And, finally got it down to like, let's just focus on everything that happened, before 1921, which really helped. But yeah, I would say that was like kind of the most interesting thing to me, learning about her. And then, sort of the guardianship laws that
Mhm.
came up back then. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great that there's, a Tanya Bolden book about that specific thing. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's like, okay, so I wanted to glance off of this, but then, oh wait, somebody else went deep. That's great. I love it. I think that's
right. Exactly.
It's a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier. So I was another question I had for you was about what you found most exciting and most challenging about doing this work. And I'm still going to ask that, but I will say you did just talk about like that process of culling, right? Like culling down facts, and I definitely would imagine that was one of the challenges. So I just wanted to acknowledge that you did answer that partly, but I'm curious if there were other things that jumped out at you as like really exciting or particularly challenging about the process of putting the book together.
Yeah, I mean, the emotional toll certainly was pretty difficult because, I worked on the majority of this book during like the early days in the middle of the pandemic, and it was just tough, like, being stuck inside, working on this, like very lucky to have work and to have a project to focus on, but also just knowing all of this stuff is going on, like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and then Christian Cooper in Central Park. It's just like all this stuff, and I'm seeing all of these parallels, and I'm like, oh my goodness. So the emotional toll, I would say, was definitely hard. But yeah, I mean, one of the most exciting parts was just finding all of this information, and not all of it being really um, happy information, but like I had always heard that police. Police departments were rooted in slave patrols. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just one of those things people kind of say, and you see it on Twitter, every week or so, and you're just kind of like, what? But then researching it and being like, wait, no, this is actually true, like as of like 1704 in South Carolina. And I just found that really fascinating. And then just sort of studying the history of policing and seeing like, being in California, I've lived in California for a long time, and just seeing that like, I don't know, the police and the KKK, and seeing like the Klan had like roots in Anaheim, California. And like, I'm just like, what? Like, I don't know. It was so fascinating to me. So it's kind of a weird thing where it's like this terrible information that you're ingesting and just reading about. But also kind of feeling maybe more powerful because now you know this information. And that was one thing that, I really felt as a kid. People would say really kind of ignorant things, especially where I grew up. And I can imagine where you grew up possibly too. And just not having the language at the time or the knowledge to fight back and say, well, no, actually, this is because of this. And so, as terrible as that information is, it really kind of felt rewarding to have that knowledge now and just be like, no, you want to say something ignorant to me? I could talk to you for 10 minutes about this thing because now I know all of it.
Yeah, it's like the thing where like 5 minutes after you leave the room, you have the perfect comeback, except this time it was 20 years. Yeah, like, I got it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
That makes sense. I mean, the emotional toll is real for sure. Like that's a powerful component of doing this work. I mean, I think I don't know how you feel, but I struggle with the balance of wanting to preserve this history, to share this history, to transform the way that we preserve and share this history. Like that feels like I would almost go so far as to say calling, right? Like I feel like that, not my exclusive calling, but like it feels like a thing that I am sort of called to do, if you want to use that terminology, which I will for the purposes of here. And yet, right, there's also this conversation that we have about, moving away from that trauma and not constantly portraying ourselves as, sort of stuck in the civil rights struggle, even though, so to me, it's a really complicated dynamic that I feel like I wade through. And I don't know what, what your relationship to that is in terms of like what I do for myself to balance, really difficult subject matter with having a little bit more fun in my work, right? And bringing joy to, there's a whole conversation about joy, right? In our writing right now. And I'm going, well, okay, but also this other thing is going on. And so like, I'm curious, I guess I'm curious, I don't have a properly formed question about this, but I guess I really felt your comment about the emotional toll. And I think that has, like is a significant sort of weighty thing both for us as creators and for our audience. And I'm curious about sort of how you balance, all of those elements, like wanting to, like wanting to illuminate, but also wanting to sort of not be stuck in a place of trauma all of the time.
Yeah, it's tough, and it was really hard to get out of it last year because, we're just all kind of stuck in this, collective hell pretty much, that doesn't really seem to be getting better. So yeah, I think it was just like intentionally making time, self-care has almost become a, word that's weaponized. But, really caring for myself and just like letting myself, I don't know, if all I want to do is watch The Real Housewives for a month straight, then I just let myself watch The Real Housewives because that's my happy place. And, like I can go work on this serious book and then do that. But yeah, it was really making, a conscious effort to sort of, like, honestly, I started like really exercising again for the first time in a long time, like regularly exercising, like cooking, just like, getting my mind away from like the work, and also I guess, just moving your body, just trying to be like, I don't know, it was just things that I guess I hadn't thought about that might be helpful, like really implementing them really helped. And I'm still doing all of that stuff now, even though I'm not working on this book now, that I found really helpful. But, sometimes I also just let myself sit with, the sadness of it, and just like, I was talking about this, I think yesterday or today. I would just like be like just sitting there like crying and typing, just sometimes you have to just like get it out. So yeah, I don't know. And sometimes I wonder, I mean, I don't want to sound like, I'm like a big old Debbie Downer, but sometimes I think like maybe I am the person to write this kind of stuff. Like, it certainly bothers me, and I feel emotional about it. But at the same time, I don't think it necessarily bothers me as much as it might bother some other people. Like I can dig in and get in there and get to the uncomfortable stuff. Like that's sort of why I studied journalism. Like I want to know the truth, even as ugly as, and I'm always like, I don't know, tell me the bad news first. Like I'm that kind of person, So
yeah.
So I kind of feel a little built for it. But even so, I think, it's incredibly important to make sure that we take care of ourselves. Did you have like any go-tos, any things that made you feel better while you were working on this?
I mean, I do the same things that you're talking about in terms of, letting myself have escapist pleasures if I want them, and and like sort of I'm trying really hard overall to not be so absorbed by work all of the time. And so looking for sort of fun things to do. I've taken up pottery. So I'm a beginning potter. So I make, little things that I'm learning that. And I'm really enjoying having a creative outlet that isn't something I feel like I need to be an expert at and be really professional at, and just something I can play around with and mess up and express myself in that way. So that's been really fun for me. But I would share your feeling that this is something that I am well equipped to do, that it's something, I mean, like I was saying, I have all this analytical stuff going on in my head where I'm making these connections anyway. It's like, I might as well put them on paper and try to, try to illuminate something for somebody else, or, really contribute to a conversation. I mean, that's something I also feel passionately about. So I think it's particularly important in this time and in this place. And you had referred to, many of the, we have a long list of names, right, that we can now recite that are very recent in terms of, police brutality and murder and other, kinds of trauma and horror and mistreatment, et cetera, in the past couple of years, let alone the past few hundred years. And so I feel like, when I pick up a book that's set 100 years ago, I want to feel like that's something that's in the past, right? I want to think that Blackbirds in the Sky is, illuminating an entirely different time and is, so far removed. And yet, right, we can easily turn on the news and witness all these echoes from that past. And, you at the very beginning of this conversation, you referred to, sort of trying to protect people from the possibility of lynching, right? Like that they had created, a special space for that. And I'm like, oh, like that was a thing. Like maybe we need that again. Like, I mean, it's like there's this sort of cyclical nature to things, and the past is not truly past, and all of that. And we're not yet a post-race nation, though we sometimes claim to be, or fantasize about being that. But we still are a place where the idea of prosperity and equality for Black people is received as a threat by many white people, to the point where tensions can still inflame to violence. I mean, these are things that we seen, you know, in the last year or two. And so I'm curious about how it strikes you to have, you know, your book on this topic coming out at this moment and in this landscape. And, you know, you touched on it a little bit and from the sort of emotional toll on yourself perspective, but I'm thinking about it in terms of, you know, putting the book out there in the world for young readers in particular. Like how does that feel to you? And what do you think about that resonance, you know, across the century?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a better time actually. Like, I was telling people last year when I was talking about my book, The Voting Booth, I was talking about like protests and stuff. Like I grew up in a very like sheltered community in Southwest Missouri, and I didn't even know people were like still protesting in the 90s. Like I just like thought, I was a teenager and I just thought like that was something people did in the 60s. So it's like, and I always wondered like, about my parents they were teenagers in this like young teenagers in the 60s. And so like, wondering like, oh, what was that like? And just sort of like this romanticized version of the civil rights movement. And now it's like, no, I think we're kind of like in it again. This is our 60s. And so I just feel like this is like the perfect time to have it out. And it was interesting working on it during I almost said 1920, working on it during 2020, because I don't know if it would be the same book if I was working on this, 2019, even 2018. Certainly I was having a lot of the same thoughts and a lot of the same issues were already present, but, I felt, I don't know, like it just changed me as a person and that I became, even more perhaps militant than I was already was. My mom likes to call me that, but but I really like, yeah, I just feel like 2020 was, well, really difficult to work on this during that time. I think was also like the perfect time. And I just, 2021, everything we've seen, I guess, gosh, we're almost done with this year. And everything we've already seen this year. Yeah, it just feels like the perfect book, with the course teachers, I'm sure both of our books will be hot books to ban pretty soon, but hopefully not, but I think we're both realists, so we could see that coming. We can see the writing on the wall, but it seems like, especially in this time when people are trying to ban books that are simply telling the truth, I'm proud to have one out there that does exactly that. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to a few audience questions because we're nearing the end of our time. If people have other questions, please feel free to toss them into the question box. But we have two from our colleagues. We have a question from Claire Rudolph Murphy,
Yay, Claire.
which is a question about what your response was to the media coverage of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, and if there was anything you wish had been noted or featured.
Ooh, Claire, hi, thank you for coming. I feel like I'm like sitting at Hamlin, like watching you sit in the back asking these questions during the student presentations. I actually took that opportunity to kind of tune out. I was done with the book, at least, done with the most of the major editing. And, I remember like seeing all these things pop up on my streaming services, like, here's a new documentary. And I had even, read about some of that stuff during my research. I was really glad to see that there was a lot more out there about, the massacre, especially on its 100th anniversary. But, I don't know. I also sort of, it kind of felt like, oh, this is like the hot thing, it's like 100 years, everyone's got to get their say in. And so I didn't really watch that much. And I'm curious how well done some of it was and how much of it was just like, we have to, put this thing out. Like, I'm really not sure. So yeah, I kind of tuned out. Glad the information was out there. And, with having so many different types of, media out there for people to consume, whether it's books or these documentaries or whatever, I think that's helpful because, people take in information different ways. So some people would rather sit with a book and not have to see images in front of, them on the screen rather than that, or some people would rather a story told to them on the television. So, I think I just come down on the side of like being happy that it's out there and just hoping that it was all done as respectfully as possible.
Yeah. I saw quite a bit of coverage, and not having your expertise on this particular topic, I don't quite know how to weigh in, but I think it makes a lot of sense that you would want a little space from from the material at that point. And I definitely remember reaching a point where I was like, I don't want to know anything new. Like I don't want to know what I missed. Like I don't want to, the book is what it
Right.
is. Like, I'm not gonna get into this.
Yeah, there was that too, where it was just like,
Yeah.
oh no, like if the book's done, you don't have space for anything you don't want to feel bad about. But luckily, in the things I did see, like some articles I would see, like I remember the New Yorker ran an article about sort of the unsung, women heroes of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it was Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish and then Eddie Faye Gates, and I pay homage to both of them in the book. So I was like, okay, cool. So mostly it was just like feeling relieved when I saw something, but yeah, I was just kind of like, I don't want to re-traumatize myself by unnecessarily having to watch the stuff, but very glad that it's out there and often gets people interested in, doing their own research into that, or maybe, other stuff like we were talking about. Yeah.
All right. We have another question from our friend Anne Ursu. So Anne says, it's really exciting to see several works of narrative nonfiction by Black women coming out this fall. And it's striking that several books of long form nonfiction from Black women is a real change from previous years. Now that you both have helped to kick down the door, where would you like to see YA nonfiction go as a field as we get more of these stories from Black women authors?
Thanks, Anne. Hi, Anne Ursu. Gosh, this year alone, it was just like so great when I saw Kekla had a nonfiction book coming out. I was like, oh, awesome. It just felt like, I think you were saying earlier, like I just have like kind of a comrade in this, because I think nonfiction is really scary, even to those of us who write it. And so I'm not sure that most people feel compelled to really go on this journey, or even feel that they may have the skills, even if they do have the skills to do it. I really just hope it becomes more popular. Even like, I think our covers are really helpful in sort of nonfiction, because you've got these really dynamic, like bright, sorry, if you have your book, please feel free to hold it up. Yeah, and I just feel like
we're yellow twins.
I know, they're like so similar. And I just feel like these were both such like dynamic covers that like, I know I would have picked up your book for sure. Like, I have this book from when I was a teenager. I think I was a teenager. It was like Tyra Banks's like, I don't know, like Book of Beauty or something. And like the way it was like structured was just kind of like, I don't want to say like your book is like Tyra Banks's book. That's not what I'm saying. But the way it was structured was just like a way to draw young people in. And I just feel like, the way that these are packaged is like a really great way to draw people in. And I know for myself, I didn't want a book that looked like a history book. Even though it's very much a history book and I'm proud of that, I wanted a cover that would draw people in and say, hey, this is like, maybe this is history, but it may be told in a different way that you're not used to. So I really like that. But yeah, I hope that YA nonfiction just like continues to expand. I want more people to try writing it, or at least I want us to write more books, and I hope that will encourage other people to do so. I think, just the sheer amount of information that we found when we were researching, and that even we weren't able to include in our books, is a testament to the fact that like we need many more books in this area.
Yeah.
How do you feel, Kekla?
Yeah, I feel similarly. Definitely, we need and want more books, and especially like what you've done in terms of okay, I'm taking this particular moment and I'm going to talk about it and I'm going to provide context and I'm going to bring it to life. I mean, that's really really powerful. I mean, I did kind of a more sweeping, right? Like here's all of Black American history, kind of like a little bit more pulled back. I mean, I zoom in on the Panthers, but I also like am providing all of this context, and there's several other books that are sort of a mix of these things, and really dynamic biographies. I keep seeing, I actually think this is maybe a tangent, but I keep seeing really interesting kind of documentaries popping up on the various streaming services of different people. Like I just watched a documentary last night about Pauli Murray, who was I was not familiar with this person, and I'm like very like upset that I didn't know who Pauli Murray was, because so this like incredibly dynamic person who was like whose thoughts and ideas were the ground, like the bedrock of a lot of what the Supreme Court did for for civil rights in the 20th century, like without exaggeration. And I'm just like, what? Like how did I not know about this person? And so I'm so excited about like all the things I'm seeing. Like I feel like I'm finding all of those little sparks, like you talked about, picking up a newspaper and reading an article and being like, what? Why didn't I know this? Like I just feel like that's happening to me all the time right now. And that's just opening up all these possibilities. And I think that people will grab onto them and just run with them. And I think that, the more space we create for that, and the more sort of models that we create for that, like we're creating models for that. if I may be so bold, right? Our books will be models for what we can do in the future, and what I hope to see, people expand on it and build on it and transform it in all these new ways, right? In the same way that we've taken the concept of writing history and transformed it into like a vision that we have for what we want. I mean, I think there's so much power and so much potential in what could come.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's exciting to be at the vanguard. I'm going to call us the vanguard.
Okay, I'll say that I will agree with that, but I'll just say that Kekla said that. So
you can just nod and smile. It's fine. So we have one more question, and then I think we'll be pretty much out of time. So this is a question taking us back to the sort of question of balancing fiction and nonfiction work. The question from Sharon November, also a colleague. Hi, Sharon. Is how do we each balance fiction and nonfiction work, and how do you juggle social issues in fiction while keeping it non-didactic? Like what we talked about, wanting to do both, right? Going forward, like I will be writing fiction and also nonfiction, but sort of, like how do we balance that? And what is the, I guess, is there an ideal balance to that? I would ask.
Right. Yeah, I know. I don't know. I mean, for me, I know I have another idea that I just I think I've even pitched to my editor. I just need to get the proposal together. But it is so much work, and then I just sort of like think about it, and I'm like, I have all the books that I need, to write that proposal, and I'm just like, oh, this is going to be so much work. So I think sometimes then, I don't know, I feel a little intimidated, and I'm like, oh, I could just go back to fiction, because again, it's just like, still it's hard work, but it's like I could just like, I don't know, write that. I don't have to do this research. I don't have to necessarily like research up top to be able to even write this proposal. So yeah, I feel like just as ideas come to me, which is how, it works with fiction, sort of like an idea kind of starts like at the back of my brain, and then, just kind of keeps like sticking around and then growing bigger and bigger. And then I can't quit thinking about it. And I'm like, God, I just got to do this, or at least have to get some words down and try this. So I think that kind of like where, when the idea pops up is like the same for me in fiction and nonfiction. And then in terms of like didacticism, God, I know it's like, there's nothing worse to me than like reading a didactic book. Like I just like can't handle it. Like I don't want to be taught a lesson when I read. Even if I'm reading like a history book, I don't want it to seem like someone's just like shouting at me. I want it to feel cohesive and like storytelling. So yeah, I don't know. I guess for me in fiction, I just try to make sure that character always comes first. So, they're going through these things. Like I'm thinking of my middle grade, The Only Black Girls in Town. Like, there's this whole historical element to it. And they have these journals in the attic that they find. And they go on this whole journey with this woman in the, 50s and 60s. But they're still kids. And they're still like, they're surfing and they're having troubles with friends and boys and all this stuff. And so I really just made sure that like, the character is at the forefront. So then, when you go on this journey with them, it doesn't seem like, okay, and now we're going to talk about history. I don't know. That's kind of how I try to approach it.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I definitely know one of my go-tos is kind of writing in vignettes where I can, I can zoom in on something like an interaction that's really powerful around an idea without having to kind of lead into it with stuff and lead out of it with stuff. I'm just be like, boom, here's your vignette. Boom, here's the next one. Boom, here's the next one. So, I mean, that's one of the ways that I think that I avoid it. But then I also sometimes have just throw in a character who's intellectual and talks in the way that I talk and thinks in the way that I think. And I'm like, hey, we'll call that narrative, right? It's fine. If he's explaining it to the person he has a crush on, maybe that's okay. That makes it action.
Right? I like that. Yeah.
So that's, I guess, one of my approaches. But I think your way of leading with character definitely is the best answer. To that question, because leading with character is always the best answer. And any teacher will tell you.
Yeah. Right.
So thank you. We actually got to all of our audience questions. Oh, well, we got to most of our audience questions. But it's been really wonderful having the chance to talk with you, Brandy. Let's hold up the books one more time.
Yes.
Revolution in Our Time, which is out in November, and Blackbirds in the Sky, which is out right now. You can click on the link at the bottom of your image, right where it says Buy Blackbirds in the Sky. Get a copy from Uncle Bobbie's right here tonight. Please support the bookstore by buying a copy, and support Brandy by buying a copy, and support your knowledge about all of Black history by reading this particular book. It's incredibly powerful and incredibly engaging, and we are so lucky, Brandy, that you put this story out into the world, that you had the courage to dive into it and bring it to life in this way. And we will look forward to seeing all the many wonderful things that the book will go on to do.
Oh, thank you, Kekla. It was like so wonderful to be in. I feel like we could talk for hours more. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me. I super appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get to do this in person again sometime in the near future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, wow, darn it, I messed my hand up. They kind of, wrapped everything up in a nutshell. And again, on behalf of Uncle Bobbie's, I do appreciate you too for, taking the time to be with us tonight. And make sure, again, that you get your books. If you aren't in the Philly area, that's completely fine. You can use the bookshop link, and it'll take you right to the website. You can get it delivered straight to you. And if you are in the Philadelphia area or in Germantown in general, you can stop by Uncle Bobbie's. I'll be there. And you can pick up your book. But I will talk to you maybe soon. I hope that you two enjoy the rest of your night. And see you later.
All right. Thanks, everyone, so much. Bye.
Good night. Thank you.